There must be more to life than this, mustn't there? I mean, I don't mean this. This is absolutely delightful, and it's so kind of you to invite me here. And to be here in this wonderful setting, great privilege. But there must surely be more to our work life, our home life, even, dare I say it, our Christian life and our church life than this. And deep down, I'm sure we all sense it. For even as we busy ourselves skimming the surface of our relationships, of our culture, of our faith, busying ourselves getting ahead or staying afloat, mercifully, still, something calls to us from deeper below the surface, doesn't it? It's not always easy to say what it is. As the poet Mary Oliver puts it, something whispered something, which kind of sums it up, really. The author, Cynthia Bourgeault, writes of our nostalgia for the infinite. I love that phrase, our nostalgia for the infinite. And the Bible, of course, reminds us in Ecclesiastes that God has set eternity in the hearts of all people. Something calls to us from deeper. Perhaps we sense it when we catch the sun rising on a beautiful autumnal morning, mist swirling around trees and leaves glinting gold in the sunlight. Or when we catch a child giggling infectiously, or even when we stand at a graveside. In those moments, we recall glimpses of the more to life that we sense there must be. The more of who we are, for instance, created to be the image bearers of God, no less. I love how the poet Wordsworth puts it in Intimations of Immortality. At our birth, he says, we arrive not in entire forgetfulness and not in utter nakedness, but trailing clouds of glory do we come from God, who is our home. We spend so much of our life then forgetting that, don't we? But occasionally, thankfully, sometimes we have our memories jogged. Recently, I was out running. The sun was out, although there was an ominous big black cloud. And as I ran down into a nature reserve, it started raining, and then the sun came back out. I turned a corner and beheld this most incredible double rainbow just arching up over the water meadows in Winchester. And I was stopped dead in my tracks, or possibly alive in my tracks. And for a few blissful moments, it reminded me that there is more to life than my failures and successes, what I wear, what I own. It lifted me up out of my own petty grievances with the world, gave me a taste of the divine, a divine sense of reconnection, if you like. But I suppose the question is, how do we stay alert and connected and alive to that sense of the more when the rainbow inevitably fades from view before our eyes and we rush on back to our busyness as usual? That's, for me, the question that nags perhaps more than any in our culture. Personally, I've gained some really helpful insight from mindfulness and from the mindfulness movement, which overlaps and resonates with much of what we would call contemplative Christian spirituality, and which helps me to realize more of the hidden treasures of my own faith, in fact. I think it's okay to say that. So I'd like to start with a few words of appreciation on that as a springboard into what I'm going to call soulfulness. Mindfulness uses simple, sustainable practices such as paying attention to our breathing, to stepping into stillness, And even kind of working on the principle of just learning again to do one thing at a time. Remember that? It's a good thing to try and do. In order to help us to be more alert and alive to this present moment, instead of constantly reliving things that have happened or pre-living things that are about to happen, helping us to become more present to all the possibilities and to the potential and to the more of this moment, as well as, of course, helping us to cope with stress. If you want a definition, then you might just think of its opposite for a moment and ask what you have done mindlessly in the last few days. Can you remember your journey getting here today? I don't know if any of you, probably most of you, have seen about the story of the virtuoso violin player Joshua Bell, who went busking in a Washington subway, and it was filmed by, I think, the Washington Post, and all set up, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people walked past as he was playing one of the world's most expensive violins and one of the world's most beautiful pieces of music, and just a handful of people across the space of an hour or two stopped. And they said that they noticed one thing in particular, and that was that almost every child that walked past tried to stop and were hurried on by their parents or guardians. So do you remember getting here today? We tend to proceed on autopilot so much of the time, don't we? How did you drink your last cup of coffee? Or eat your last meal? What were the flavours and textures of the food like? How did you listen when a friend was sharing something really important or special with you? Did you listen without agenda, or did it just remind you of something that you wanted to tell them back? Sometimes I used to catch myself responding to a text when I was reading the kids a bedtime story. We are all culpable, I'm sure. Jon Kabat-Zinn, the professor of medicine who helped to found the mindfulness-based stress reduction program, which many of you will have heard of, describes mindfulness. I love the clarity that some of these people in mindfulness speak of in terms of profound things. We can learn as Christians from them sometimes. He speaks of mindfulness as wakefulness with open-hearted presence. Wakefulness with open-hearted presence. And I really love that. I wonder how many people you know who are wakeful with open-hearted presence. They're often few and far between, aren't they? But they're wonderful to know when you come across them. I like to imagine Jesus as having been very wakeful and having a deeply open-hearted presence, awake to who and what is before him, as well as being awake to the presence of God within every moment. Meditation is one specific way of becoming more wakeful with open-hearted presence. I know that word is a bit of a buzzword sometimes, and sometimes it puts us off, doesn't it? But the mindfulness expert from the Oxford Mindfulness Centre and the Anglican clergyman, Mark Williams, refers to meditation very helpfully and undramatically as calmly abiding in the present moment. Calmly abiding in the present moment. And that's something that we can all try, isn't it? We don't necessarily need to sit cross-legged for half an hour on a meditation mat, although that might be useful. You could just make yourself a cup of tea and step outside and give yourself permission to be for a few minutes instead of forever doing. And if you need some kind of spiritual permission slip, you might just go to the Psalms, to the psalmist who says, "Be still and know that I am God." We are often, as Christian believers, stuck on the fast forward as well, aren't we? And if you really need something to do, if you really must do something while you're standing outside for 5 minutes, try watching the clouds. Seriously, try watching the clouds. The founder of the Cloud Appreciation Society, a guy called Gavin Pretor-Pinney, he's done a fantastic TED Talk on appreciating clouds. He says that one of the most important things about watching clouds is that it gives you permission to do nothing else but watch clouds. And we so rarely ever give ourselves permission to do anything like that. Step outside and be still. What I love us to do just before we continue is to have a moment's stillness. If that's okay. We're not going to do anything weird or spooky, and if you feel at all uncomfortable, just sit quietly while the rest of us sit quietly, and no one will know the difference. You may like to close your eyes. I'm going to close my eyes for a moment. Otherwise, do stare into space or a fixed object, or Elizabeth, if you like. And just what I'd love you to do, just for a moment, is to relax your body. You might, for a moment, notice if you have any stresses or areas of tension in your body that you hadn't realized were there. It's quite easy for us to spend half the morning with our jaws clenched or with our shoulders tight in the brace position, ready for what's going to go wrong. But actually today, what we're going after is really good things. Going after presence, aliveness, presence of God. So notice if you have any areas of tension or stress in your body, and just simply try and relax your whole body. And it really helps, without sounding too cheesy, to smile as well, remembering that we are going after good things. It really helps you to relax. And what I'd love you to do is just to slow your breathing down a little bit and deepen it just a little bit. We tend, when we're racing breathlessly from place to place and task to task, to take far too many physically shallow breaths. If you're a runner or a swimmer or a cyclist, or you love to dance or sing, you'll know how crucial it is to breathe deeply through the strides and the strokes, because it gives you physical energy. But of course, it gives us more than that too, doesn't it? It gives us that emotional sense of calmness, taking the deeper breath, a sense of mental clarity. And if you are like me, and most of us probably in this room, and you struggle to quieten your ever-chattering mind down when you go into a period of stillness, one very, very simple way to help is just to bring all of your attention and your awareness to your breathing. It gives the mind something to do and allows you to be a little more fully present here. We remember, of course, that we are God-breathed, and that God is closer to us than our breath. So what I'd love you to do is just to bring all of your attention and your focus onto your breathing just for a few moments, and watch that in-breath coming all the way in, right to its end, and then the out-breath going all the way out. And just for 30 seconds now, let's relax, breathe, and bring all of our attention to our breathing, and then we'll continue. Just before you open your eyes again, I'd love you to notice how you feel, what you experience, not trying to manipulate anything, but just notice how you are. And you may like to ask yourself, after even a pause as short as that, what difference could that pause make? If I were now to go and have a meeting with somebody, or work on something creative, or have a difficult conversation with somebody that I need to have on the phone for work, or whatever it is, what difference would it make to the quality of energy and attention you bring to what you're about to do? And what difference would it make to the people who are about to encounter you? And what's stopping you from every now and again taking a very short pause like that? Okay. Lovely to sit in stillness together, actually, isn't it? As a group, it's really lovely. I hope that you could appreciate that. A couple of other ideas. You could just try a very slow walk, or a slightly slower walk than usual, a walk of awareness down a familiar path or road or pavement. Where I live in Winchester, when I'm working with people one-to-one, I often invite them to do a really nice slow walk, slower than normal walking pace. And it's so embarrassing to begin with, especially if they're local. And it's a really good way of noticing the chattering of your mind, which really pipes up when you're walking slowly down Winchester High Street. And your mind, your insecure, anxious, chattering, ego-driven mind is saying, who am I going to bump into? What do people think of me? I look like a complete idiot. When's he going to let me stop this? But actually, if you carry on just for about long enough, you can just settle that down and keep going. You begin to notice things, details on the pavement you may have never noticed before, even though you've walked this route thousands of times before. And you notice things up above, and you notice faces and textures and colours, and the quality of the space outside and inside begins to shift. You may just give thanks for 3 things when you stop at a red light when you're driving. Or, as happened to me this morning when the train was delayed, you may refuse the lure of your phone and instead just stand and breathe for the 5 minutes that the train is being delayed and notice what you notice. All sorts of opportunities for those of us who say, I just don't have time for this sort of stuff. So mindfulness can be really, really helpful and has many benefits, from decreasing stress to increasing creativity and emotional resilience and empathy, and its benefits have been well documented. But the danger is, I think, that we can end up just seeing it as just another tool to keep us calm within the frazzling and unsustainable lifestyle that otherwise we have absolutely no intention of changing. Little pill to help us keep going. Worse still, if we're sent to a mindfulness course by a boss who wants us to learn to kind of stay calm as we conquer the world on their behalf. It's not good, is it? The psychologist Bill Plotkin says that we should beware of using any techniques like that actually just help us to become better adapted cogs in the otherwise toxic machinery of life. Nice metaphor, that. I don't want to be a better adapted cog. I'm not sure about you. Most helpfully, mindfulness helps to quieten that incessant chatter of our anxious minds. But as a Christian, I believe, of course, that we are so much more than minds alone. And I think that when we enter stillness like that, just as sometimes when we behold a rainbow, or stand at a graveside. What happens is we are taken to a tantalizing threshold, which is for me the threshold of soul, where the mind is just willing to relinquish its grip on the control panels of our life and perhaps, for a change, let soul take the lead. And that's for me where it gets really, really exciting. I don't mind my children looking back on my life when I'm dead and gone and saying, he was a really mindful dad. That would be quite an accolade in this sort of social media age. But it does leave me, as Elizabeth said, a little bit cold. I'd much rather they were able to say he lived a soulful life. He lived a soulful life. Think of the word soul for a moment, and I wonder what you picture. Soul or soulful music? A soulful cafe? Soulful meal with friends? Or a gallery that inspires? Soulful stretch of countryside? Or you might like to imagine something or someone or somewhere soulful that you have just literally encountered recently, where your soul stirred. What was it about that place or that person that somehow touched you, inspired you, connected you with the more? It's often almost completely impossible to say, isn't it, what it is and what makes something soulful. And the nature of soul defies description and definition and deconstruction, really, doesn't it? But the first mention of the word soul in the King James version of the Bible just gives me a little poetic clue. So in Genesis 2, verse 7, we read that God formed a man from the dust and breathed life into him, and he became a living soul. This is the Hebrew word nephesh, which means several things at once, as most Hebrew words usually do, but which scholars seem to agree has an overarching sense of wholeness or the whole. So in this verse, God takes two good things, dust, matter, and spirit. Often those are kind of set in tension when we think about spirituality, aren't we? Spirit equals good, flesh equals bad. But he takes these two things and creates something that is a whole, that is greater than the sum of the parts. And that whole is the living soul. And that, for me, helps to explain why soul relentlessly connects us with that something that is greater than the sum of the parts of our life, with the more. And in my book, I explore three areas in particular where I believe soul does that. First of all, by opening us up to the more of who we are individually. Secondly, by opening us up to the depth and quality of relationships that we can nurture. And third, by opening us up to the more of our life's work. And I'd like to touch briefly on those three areas now. So first then, soul is the more of who we were created to be, individually and uniquely, trailing clouds of glory as we remembered from God who is our home. It's easy for us as believers to often be sort of so self-deprecating, it's kind of almost, it hurts. But if we are image bearers of God, then let us take ourselves seriously in a sort of non-ego-driven way, in a soulful way. We each have a unique fingerprint, and we each have a unique way of touching the world. We each have, I believe, a unique retina, and we all have unique ways of seeing the world and expressing the world. Bill Plotkin again says that the soul calls to us from our subterranean depths, pushing up like a flower that grows up through a crack in the concrete paving of our life. Thank goodness it does keep calling. I wonder, how have you paved over your soulful, made in the image of God's self, through lifestyle or through attachments or through busyness or whatever it is? How have you paved over your soulful self? What are the flowers that you sometimes glimpse on the pavement? And when was the last time you truly met yourself? You might like to, as an exercise, go looking for flowers that are growing through the cracks of the pavement and just stand there for a while and allow it to speak to you. At a soul level, you don't need to put words to it. Just prayerfully stand there and allow it to speak of your own uniqueness that often gets covered over for all sorts of different reasons. The Hebrew word hineni means here I am. And it features with many of the great biblical characters. So when God calls Abraham, before he's about to ask him to sacrifice Isaac, he says, Abraham, Abraham. Abraham replies, hineni, here I am. As Moses turns aside and sees the bush on fire, he hears a voice calling from the bush, Moses, Moses, and Moses says, hineni, here I am. The boy Samuel in the temple hears a voice in the night and thinks it's Eli, comes to Eli and says, hineni, here I am. Isaiah hears God saying, whom shall I send? And Isaiah says, hineni, here I am, send me. And I really love those three words, here I am. And if you want to do anything that might help you just to experience more of who you are prayerfully in the present, before then presenting your whole vulnerable self to God, you may just imagine for a few moments God calling your name. You may even like to just speak that out loud a few times over and over in a room with the door closed. You can do it on the top of the bus if you want. And then respond, here I am. And speak that over a few times, a few minutes, for as long as you like. First of all, presenting yourself, here I am, here I am. And then presenting yourself in vulnerability and poise to God. Beautiful thing to do. Hineni is powerful, of course, because with that we acknowledge our relationship with God, don't we? And I suppose with mindfulness, sometimes we don't always do that. We don't always acknowledge that relationship that we have with God. I am here, and in being here, I'm present to the more of God's presence. Sometimes at Christian gatherings, we sort of say, wow, that was an amazing meeting. God really showed up today. I think it's our responsibility to be showing up to God's presence, the more of God in a deep way. So second, soul connects us with the more of how we relate to God, as well as to each other and to ourselves and to the world around us, in particular to nature and God's creation, I would say. I wonder how we typically tend to relate to the world around us. Rowan Williams, I think it was, said that at our best we're not consumers of this world, even though most of us act like it most of the time. We're not consumers of this world, we are in communion with it. It's a subtle but huge difference. I always say to the people who come on my retreats, I was leading one yesterday, an autumn-themed retreat, try not to see this as a consumerist event. Try instead to be in communion with the day, with the season, with God, with yourself, with others. We have the wonderful opportunity every single day through who we meet, through being mindful to God's presence, and through reconnecting with nature, to turn things around. No longer relating ego to ego, looking for what we can get out of an encounter or a relationship, but soul to soul, as deep calls unto deep. You think again about some of those rare souls who just are so connected and present and alive and assured. What difference their presence makes when you come into their presence. Just through who they are, not so much through what they do, just through who they are, you tend to expand and feel inspired and grow. It's a marvellous opportunity. The poet and priest and philosopher and maverick John O'Donoghue speaks of God as our soul friend. He wrote a wonderful book, Anam Cara, that I'm sure many of you will have read, and that is Gaelic for soul friend. And he reminds us that instead of living life defensively in that brace position, we can discover a soul friendship at the heart of all of life. I wonder what difference that would make to the way we lived one day if we approached it from the perspective of nurturing a soul friendship with all of life. And this does extend, by the way, to God's creation and to nature. As Elizabeth said, we ran a couple of lovely spring-themed walking retreats from St. Paul's, or to St. Paul's, this year. And along the way, we connected with God's creation, coming down Green Park and St. James's Park and seeing trees and water, and connected with God through God's creation, through poetry and stillness, through watching, through being, through breathing. And we remembered as we went that we are indeed part of the beauty that we see around us. We are part of God's created beauty, a part of the scene. So we did simple things like breathing and standing beneath trees, and we stood on a bridge and just watched the river flowing away and just asked for help, letting things go gently. And then we turned to face the river coming towards us, and we asked for God's help for the days and weeks to come, that whatever the river of life brought to us, that we could exhibit God's love and presence and mercy within it and be present to that instead of seeking constant escape from it. And you could do worse than borrow Keats's sublime Ode to Autumn this season as a starting point to do your own seasonal walk. Get out into creation. See yourself as part of the beauty. Appreciate the way fruit ripens to the core. The way the acorn must crack and the leaves must fall. Let nature speak to you. Let your mind be calmed and your soul be stirred. Notice what this most profound of seasonal moments can teach us, what Brian McLaren so poetically calls the autumn blaze of colour between green and gone. Notice it, connect with it again. So soul connects us to ourself. It opens up the depth and quality of relationships that we can have with the world around us. And finally, soul is incarnated, it's fleshed out through our life's work, I believe, whether that's paid or unpaid. While so much spirituality is all about escape, soul, let's remember, is found within that wonderful fusion of spirit and matter. So it's earthed in the here and now. And we follow Jesus, who didn't show us an escape route out of this rotten world, as if we were wafting away on a plume of spiritual incense, but a way back in, a practical flesh and blood way back in to embrace it in love. The poet and artist Cahill Gilbrand says that work is love made visible, which I love. Work is love made visible. It doesn't have to be about massaging the ego, as so often our careers end up being. Instead, it can be about manifesting the soul. I wonder how you touch the world in love through your life's work in only the way that you can. The filmmaker Robert Bresson once said, "Make visible that which without you might perhaps never be seen. Make visible that which without you might perhaps never be seen. And here's the wonderful thing about incarnation. While soul speaks most evocatively of our heights and breadths and depths, nevertheless, it's fleshed out simply and movingly within the physicality of the everyday, in the meal that you share with others, or gathering around a crackling fire in November outside looking at the stars, or playing music that you've written in a local pub, or in a long-awaited embrace of reconciliation, the physicality of that, or in unexpected tears. Soulfulness, after all, is no three-point plan for the perfect life. It tends, I think, to follow the path of descent, like Jesus, or like the autumn acorn, which must fall to the ground to have any chance of becoming that mighty oak. We may obsess about polishing the shiny surface of our life, but it's usually through the cracks that the light flows in and the life pours out. And I don't know about you, but I've found so very often that it's the people who have experienced times of loss, often tragedy, and who, having faced into them, have begun gently to move through them. It's often those who seem to have a real deep sense of soul coursing through their life and a connection to the more. People like my friends, Howard and Jan, who lost a child when they were young and who walk with a limp, undoubtedly, but who just bring a warmth and a degree of connection to the world around them through their work, through their life, that is inspiring. Or my friend Linda, who was made redundant from a decent-sized job fairly recently, or a couple of years ago, with an NGO who's doing great things to alleviate poverty in the world. And instead of going out to get another job and match it like for like, which is what her ego wanted her to do, instead, she paused and she listened to the nudge of soul and did what she had always most deeply loved, which was baking. And she started with cupcakes and she started selling them. And in the end, she opened up a beautiful little cafe space where she welcomes in mums and toddlers and the unemployed, all sorts of different people who gather and talk and share wisdom and buy coffee and eat cake. Beautiful soul space. She said, I've come to see that there are different ways of changing the world. Instead of doing what I felt I ought to do, I followed my gut, my passion, my soul, I guess. It's not always been easy, of course, but I feel a sense of everything I've done in my life so far leading me to this point and of being where I was meant to be. The writer Christine Caine puts it like this: sometimes when you're in a dark place, you think you've been buried, but you've actually been planted. And I think of Jesus and the physicality and the soulfulness of Jesus. And we remember the Last Supper, which, despite the deepness of its pain, was surely, truly soulful. A meal with friends in which Jesus washes feet, breaks bread, shares wine. Spiritual yet physical, and it creates something, of course, immeasurably more than the sum, and it's something we can still participate in today. Breaking bread, sharing wine, having fellowship. And how about the resurrection? When Jesus prepares, after the resurrection, when Jesus prepares a charcoal fire with his own nail-scarred hands and cooks fish for his friends on a beach at sunrise. Imagine the smell, the taste, the moment. Exquisitely, those followers sample the taste of both fish and forgiveness. And for Peter, of course, his soul is restored. Perhaps one of the most soulful moments in the biblical sweep of the biblical narrative. Jesus once said, "What does it profit anyone to gain the whole world but to lose their soul?" But I wonder, what if this world was never ours to gain anyway? But instead a place in which we could help each other to reconnect as deep calls unto deep and as soul calls to soul. Getting a divine taste or foretaste of the soulful flavours of the kingdom of God, of fish, of forgiveness, and so much more of the more. Because there must be more to life than this, mustn't there? I'd love to end with just one sentence from good old John O'Donoghue, who I met over breakfast once when I was interviewing him for the Church Times. And he said to me this: we were talking about the busyness of the world and the fact that we don't often have time to stop and overhear what's going on inside as well as overhear God or anything else. And he very quickly got onto soul. He just oozed it. And he said this to me, just leant forward, and he said, whispered almost in a conspiratorial tone, in a beautiful Irish accent, which I won't try now. He said, "Soul is a dangerous thing to have. It links you into the infinite, whether you like it or not, and it will not let you rest happily in your mediocrity or escapism." May it be so. Thank you.